Hey, how's it going, everyone? Regulus Rising here in the first video of a series of astrological lessons, which I'm planning on doing. They're completely free. I'm not asking for anything whatsoever other than your willingness to learn. And also, happy faces, of course. So, I'm going to start by talking about the difference between the signs and the houses. You know, most of us have a general inclination of what a sign is. We all know. We all can raise our hands in the air and say, I'm a Scorpio, I'm a Aquarius. But if someone were to ask you, well, gee, what house is your sun in? You might not know the answer to that. So I'm going to go ahead and explain the difference between the signs and the houses. The first thing I want to say is that Western astrology goes by the seasonal year, not by the calendar year. So, in the calendar year, we're used to the year starting with the month of January, whereas in a seasonal year, it starts out with April, because April is the first month in spring. Spring is the first season in a seasonal year, and that directly correlates with the signs. Aries is actually the first sign in the seasonal year, or I'm going to now call it the astrological year. And Pisces is the last sign in the astrological year. And so which one of these two are we going to use, guys? Are we going to be using the seasonal year or the calendar year? Well, I hope by now you've understood that we're going to be using the seasonal year, not the calendar year. And again, this correlates with the astrological year. And, those astrological signs directly correlate with the houses which they rule over. And I will get into the houses in just a little bit. But first I want to ask you a question. True or false? Two people born on the same day are the same type of person. Is that true or false? Well, if you answer false, you were right. And let me give you an example. Here we have two people, Napoleon and Joe Jonas of the Jonas Brothers. And both of them are born on August 15th. Now, are they alike? If someone were to ask me, hey, Regulus, do you think Napoleon and Joe Jonas are alike? I would answer by saying, absolutely not. Absolutely not, okay? And the reason for that is because, let's actually take a step back and say, both of them are born August 15th. If you look at your horoscope on yahoo.com or in US Weekly magazine or, any of that, you should just look up the sign Leo and then get your horoscope for the day, right? Well, not really. And the reason for that is because there is another system which overlays the system of the signs called the houses system. And the house system is based on two things. It's based on the time of birth, what time you were born, and the location where you were born. So even though they're both born on the same day, their sun is in the same place in Leo. They were born at different times at different places. So they are therefore going to have, their sun are going to be in different houses. And we'll see here actually the Napoleon sun is in the 10th house, which is the house of Capricorn, because Capricorn is the 10th sign in the astrological year. And we'll see that the Jonas's sun is in the 8th house, which is the sign of Scorpio, because Scorpio is the 8th sign in the astrological year, correct? Good. Now, what are the houses? And I'm going to make this very simple, explain it within the next couple minutes to a point where you will understand. And the houses are nothing but a mundane meaning of the sign itself, okay? Now, before I continue, there's one thing I want you to understand, that because there are 12 signs, there are also 12 houses, okay? 12 signs, 12 houses. And that is always the case. Never changes, okay? Even on Sundays, guys. Even on Sundays. So, let's go ahead and ask ourselves, what are some basic characteristics of the two signs I've listed here? And the reason we want to do that is because in order to define the sign in order to define the house which the sign owns, we need to understand a little bit about that sign. So what we're actually going to do in order to understand the houses is we're going to look at each sign and we're going to take the most simplistic, most mundane meaning of each sign and simply apply that as the meaning of the house. So here we have Gemini. Mundanely, the first thing we think of when we think of Gemini is that it is the sign of communication. And when we think of Libra, we think of it being as the sign of relationships, amongst other things I've listed here for the both of them. So I'm just going to highlight the both of those, or the mundane meanings of those signs. And remember that Gemini is the, what sign is it in the astrological year? It is the third. Good. And Libra is the seventh sign in the astrological year. So we will see here that Gemini rules over the third house. And the definition of the third house is the house of communication. And we'll see here that Libra, which is mundanely the sign of relationships, rules over the seventh house, which is the house of relationships. So pretty simple here, guys. We're doing nothing other than taking the mundane meaning of each sign and applying it to the house it rules. So here is the chart of John F. Kennedy. The birth information's on the side in case you want to follow along. And again, remember this, you guys. I can't stress this enough. 12 signs, 12 houses, and that never changes. So we can look here at the third house, house of communication, and what sign rules over the third house, guys? Gemini. Good. And what sign rules over the seventh house, the house of relationships? It's Libra. Good job. And now, one thing I want to say here is that let's use the third house as an example. The third house is the house of Gemini. But if we look here, we actually see that Gemini is nowhere within the third house. It's not there. And if we take a closer look at this chart, we can see that the sign of Gemini is actually over here. It's nowhere near the third house. And the reason for that is because houses and signs can be in two completely different places. And as a matter of fact, they almost always are. They almost always are in different places. It's more common for them to be in different places than it is for them to be in that place. So, you know, even though we are talking about the third house of Gemini, that house will not be in the same place where the sign of Gemini is. Now, one thing I want to note here is what I want you to do is take a look at JFK's sun. This is the sun right here. And we can see here that it is in 7 degrees Gemini. Okay? And I want you to just take a look at this chart. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to change his birth time from 3 p.m. and take it a couple hours back to 10 a.m. Alright? So we see here that the chart actually looks pretty different. Although it's very interesting because if we look at JFK's sun, we see that it's still in 7 degrees Gemini. So it hasn't really moved. And as a matter of fact, all these other planets haven't really moved either. They're still in their same degrees in the signs. The only thing that has changed by changing the birth time here are the houses. And so, you know, that's important to remember that the houses change by the time and by the location. All right. Now, in order to get a stronger definition of the houses, let's, again, look at this list. Again, remember that Aries being the first sign of the astrological year and Pisces being the last, and that directly correlates with the houses that they rule. And again, in order to get the definition of the house, we take the mundane meaning of that sign and apply it to the house which it rules. So here are some mundane definitions of each sign. And these are all pretty clear for the most part, except for Leo, I feel, ego, and that's kind of a broad definition. So let me kind of single that out in true Leo fashion. And, you know, explain what are some things that show our ego. Creativity is one in terms of how we express it, whether it's through the arts, through our work, or even with humor. You know, even the jokes we make in a conversation can express our creativity. Entertainment is another in terms of what kinds of entertainment we like, whether it's sports, music, games, what kinds of that. And it can even be politics or business. If someone has Saturn in the fifth house, they're probably going to like politics. If they have Mercury in the fifth house, they're probably going to like business. And also love affairs in terms of how we express ourselves with the opposite sex, whether it be playful or romantic. And it is also the house of children because, as you know, most children tend to have large egos. So now we can overlay those definitions of the houses onto this chart to get a clear picture of what we're looking at. And again, all I've done here is I've taken the mundane definition of the sign and applied it to the house which that sign rules. And let's say you're following me, but you're saying, Regulus, I still don't really understand what it is that you're trying to come across. Well, the point you're trying to come across here. So let me put it in a simpler way. Here we want to find which house Gemini rules over and what that house means. So mundanely, Gemini is a sign of communication, correct? And then we're going to look at what month in the astrological year Gemini rules. In this case, it's the third. So we can therefore deduct that Gemini rules over the third house, and it is the house of communication. That's my phone, guys. And how are the houses drawn? This is very interesting, actually, because the houses are based upon a system that follows the sun. So it's to throw some scientific terms out there, if you're familiar with what nanolemma is or what it means for the sun to be at high noon. That is exactly what the house's chart is based on. So the sun, when it is at its highest point at noon, is going to be where? At the top of the chart, because that is the highest point which the sun is in the day, right? And likewise the opposite. The sun is going to be at the bottom of the chart when it is at the lowest point of the day, probably around midnight. That is how the houses system works. And in order to draw a chart with houses in it, we have to have the birth time and birth location of that person, which makes sense, really, because daytime in Los Angeles, California is going to be nighttime in Paris. So here we have no birth time at all. And if we have no birth time, we have no houses. These planets, I call them homeless. They look like they're begging for change, guys. But let's go ahead and input the birth time and the birth location, and ta-da, we have the chart which we began with originally. So yes, there is a difference between signs and houses. And just because you're a Gemini doesn't mean that you should exclude which house your sun is in, because they are both equally important.